on places like Facebook since the ban. People are going underground, she says. New York's crackdown on short-term rentals has dramatically reshaped the vacation rental market in the city. People are using sites like Craigslist, Facebook, Howfee, and others, where they can search for guests or places to book without the checks and balances of booking platforms like Airbnb. Hotel prices are expected to rise with more demand. Search for a short stay on Airbnb, and there are a few places scattered across the map. Many of those old listings have turned into stays of 30 days or longer, meaning they do not need to be registered. AirDNA, a short-term rental intelligence firm, found just 2,300 short-term rentals on Airbnb in New York City by late September. The number of stays advertised as long-term rentals now makes up 94% of Airbnb's listings in the city, AirDNA's data shows. Hosts must meet strict requirements to be approved as a short-term rental. They can have only 2 guests, and the host must be present in the same home during the stay. This change banned many whole apartment listings, except for those that fell under a Class B dwelling category like hotels, boarding houses, and clubs. But people are finding ways around the rules. Many listings on Airbnb now include a space in the property's description for hosts to enter a registration number or state that they are exempt. Wired searched Airbnb for stays in New York and found many short-term rentals that list themselves as exempt from the city's registration rules, but there are still several entire units available for short stays that do not appear to be hotels or exempt units. In one listing marked as exempt, the host asks for guests to avoid interacting with the building's concierge. On another listing, a host claims they used to live in the unit but have moved to New Jersey and now rent it out. One appears to be a row home in a mostly residential neighborhood in Brooklyn. Airbnb uses the city's verification system to flag unregistered units. The company did not provide comment for the story addressing these specific listings flagged by Wired. Nathan Rotman, the public policy regional lead for Airbnb, says the company is working closely with the city as it implements the new registration law. Inside Airbnb's data shows some 2,300 short-term properties have listed themselves as exempt from registration on Airbnb. There are a few hundred more that do not say whether they are exempt or registered, according to the data. Another 35,000 are long-term rentals. Airbnb did not confirm the numbers in the data scraped by Inside Airbnb. The Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement in New York, which manages the registration program, did not provide an update on the total number of short-term rentals it has registered or whether it has issued violations for illegal listings. The New York City law is just one striking way cities are fighting back against short-term rentals. Supporters of the rule argued it would free up apartments for New Yorkers who pay high rent prices and are facing housing shortages and insecurity. But others, including small-time landlords, said it would take away a source of flexible extra income without making a dent in the housing supply crisis. Those smaller landlords are still pushing New York City councilors to change the rules to allow them to rent out their units. ROAR is made up of people who own 1 or 2 homes and want to lease them out as short-term rentals. These hosts feel they have been unfairly looped in with big landlords. Grossman says ROAR has met with city councilors in hopes of changing the law so that smaller hosts can still legally do short-term renting. Outside of Airbnb, people are posting listings and seeking short-term rentals in Facebook groups. Ads on Craigslist for rentals have weekly or nightly prices listed. Wired found one listing with a weekly and nightly price on Craigslist that also appears on Airbnb, but can only be booked for 30 days or longer on Airbnb. These off-platform rentals pose risks to both guests and hosts, who could get scammed without the protections of bigger companies like Airbnb. Craigslist did not respond to a request for comment. Meta, Facebook's parent company, did not comment on specific listings flagged by Wired, but the company's policies require buyers and sellers in Facebook Marketplace to comply with local laws, and the company prohibits people from promoting illegal activity on Facebook pages and groups. Then there's Howfee, another website listing short-term rentals. Wired found that many of the listings come from guests who joined the site in September, the same month New York's new registration rules took effect. The intention is for guests to book directly with hosts. Think Airbnb without the fees. The site compares prices for the same property on Airbnb and Howfee and claims to show how much people can save by avoiding Airbnb's fees. Howfee has received a notice from New York City about the new rule and is reviewing how to comply with their rules. Tice Oftink, CEO of Howfee, tells Wired, Ofting says Haufi, unlike Airbnb and other rental sites, does not take commissions on transactions between hosts and guests, and argues the company is therefore not part of the transaction. He says hosts are responsible for complying with local laws when listing properties. After the rule change, Airbnb is shifting attention away from New York, which was once its biggest market. Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky has recently said the company is exploring longer rentals as well as car rentals and dining pop-ups. And it has got its eye on Paris, its largest market and home to the 2024 Summer Olympics. I was always hopeful that New York City would lead the way, that we would find a solution in New York and people would say, if they can make it in New York, they can make it anywhere, Chesky said during an event in September hosted by Skift, a travel industry news site. I think, unfortunately, New York is no longer leading the way. It's probably a cautionary tale. Make sure to check out our other Wired podcasts. Today in Wired Business, how deepfake audio is a political nightmare. Checking in on Wired Science, new malaria vaccines offer a real shot at fighting the disease. And on Wired Security, 23andMe user data stolen in targeted attack on Ashkenazi Jews. Listen to these stories and more at wired.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening to Wired. Check back in tomorrow to hear more stories from Wired.com.
From WSJ Tech News Briefing at 2:01 a.m. today.
At Salesforce, we're all about asking more of AI. Questions like, where is the data going? Is it private? Is it secure? Is it ready to use now? How about now? And if not now, when? And how? Get answers you can trust from Salesforce at askmoreofai.com.
Welcome to Tech News Briefing. It's Tuesday, October 10th. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. Technology is often billed as something that can unite and connect us all, regardless of where we live, our nationality, or our politics. But the business of tech, be it big tech or startups, can't escape the geopolitical realities of the world. And in this episode, we're going to hear about some of the most pressing challenges facing the tech economy right now. Starting in Israel, following land, air, and sea attacks from Hamas militants over the weekend, more than 700 Israelis have been confirmed dead, according to Israeli authorities, and over 560 Palestinians have been killed, according to the health ministry in Gaza. White House officials said 9 U.S. citizens have died, while other U.S. citizens are unaccounted for. Dozens of military and civilian hostages taken by Hamas are believed to have been taken into Gaza as the fighting continues. Meanwhile, there are concerns the conflict will spread. All of this is having an impact on the country's tech startups and venture capital investors. Yulia Chernova from the WSJ's pro-venture capital team has been covering this, and she joins us now. Yulia, this war has a lot of people, including startup founders and investors, being called up for the draft. How is that impacting the local tech economy?
The draft is pretty significant, and it's a small country. That means that many businesses have sizable percentages of their employee base being called up. I spoke with a founder who's been called up. He's delegating. He's had to get his family prepared. His wife is pregnant. And then get his startup employees prepared as much as possible who are going through their own emotional drama and situations. And he said that he's offline a lot of the times, but when he's online, he answers some of the most crucial questions, and the rest the team handles.
So he's trying to juggle being a soldier and being a founder?
Absolutely. And a lot of the people in the tech sector in Israel are trying to use technology for various volunteer efforts and are trying to be as useful as they can, whether it's finding missing people, trying to rescue people.
We've already seen somewhat of a pullout from Israeli tech startups and Israeli investment due to the tensions around some of the judicial changes in the country. What does this latest crisis mean for the tech sector in Israel?
It's hard to tell right now. I mean, the venture market globally is in a downturn. It's not just an issue for Israel. And most of the money in venture capital funds is in the U.S. A lot of U.S. venture funds have been investing much less internationally since the downturn started, including into Israel. And the situation on the ground there with judicial reform, conflicts and protests, hasn't helped the Israeli startup to attract more money, that's for sure. So this crisis comes at a time when that startup ecosystem has been experiencing a downturn. And what happens next? It's, on the one hand, makes investing there maybe more risky to some degree. At the same time, the whole country is galvanizing and uniting in a way that they weren't united because of the political tensions over the past year. So some people believe that this will show the resilience of Israel and will actually attract more investors. But that's to be seen.
All right, that's our reporter, Yulia Chernova. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We have live coverage of this developing story on WSJ.com. All right, after the break, we'll hear from a U.S. official who says tensions between Washington and Beijing could erupt into a conflict that pulls in big tech. Stick with us. We'll be back in a moment.
At Salesforce, we're all about asking more of AI. Questions like, where is the data going? Is it private? Is it secure? Are you sure? Are you sure you're sure? Is anyone really sure? For sure? Get answers you can trust from Salesforce at askmoreofai.com.
China is a country where a significant amount of the world's technology hardware is built, including for US-based companies. But a potential decoupling or split between the US and Chinese economies is threatening to upend supply chains and customer bases. Jacob Hellberg, a member of the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, says there's even a real possibility of war, one that could pull in and shake up the global tech sector. At the WSJ's CIO Summit, Hellberg sat down with our tech columnist Christopher Mims to discuss these issues. Here are highlights from their conversation.
So there's a lot of animosity, there's escalating tensions, but the US and China are still, especially in terms of tech, very interdependent. When you think about how does one build an iPhone without China, for example, I mean, it raises the issue of, does the US do it on its own? Like, does decoupling mean deglobalization?
I think what you're seeing overwhelmingly is that the answer is no. You saw this with the Biden administration hosting the trilateral summit with South Korea and Japan. You see this with the deepening of America's relationship with the UK and Australia through AUKUS. There's a lot of efforts going on in the administration as well as through Congress to actually deepen relationships with a lot of other countries, including India, which is a very large, fast-growing market. The issue is that China poses unique political and geopolitical risks to the United States. And so you're seeing a lot of, in my view, justified concerns by policymakers and an enormous impetus to recalibrate that relationship.
Now, the government can only do so much of that on its own. What are businesses doing? Are they responding by attempting to decouple, or are they proceeding business as usual?
I think a lot of business people are actually very savvy and they're seeing the direction of travel. They're seeing that in Washington, we're headed towards a climate where you're going to see more regulation, more scrutiny on anything that involves transactions with China. But you're also seeing a business climate in China that's becoming really, really difficult to operate in.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is that so much of what's driving this talk of decoupling is China's seems very credible threat to retake Taiwan, where overwhelming majority of the world's most advanced microprocessors, including for Apple and all the custom chips now that are powering a lot of the AI revolution, are all manufactured. I feel like when I talk to business people, there's a disconnect between their feeling about the odds of that and how the national security types that I talk to feel about it.
Yeah, so interestingly, in the U.S., we've kind of seen a tale of two cities between Washington and our other economic hubs around the country, where you're right that national security people in Washington actually see probably a more than 50% chance of a hot conflict with China break out potentially in the next 5 years. Xi Jinping said he wants to reunify Taiwan by 2027, which a lot of people think really means 2025. And the United States is the main country that stands in his way with a smooth reannexation of Taiwan. And so obviously this is a potentially cataclysmic event. And our business community has been very, very slow to catch on to this reality. And to your point, ultimately, if this happens, if decoupling happens to you, it's going to be really painful. And it's probably going to mean that you're going to see billions of dollars in assets get frozen or nationalized overnight.
I mean, what happens to the companies on day one of that conflict? Like, does Tim Cook just call up Samsung and be like, I need to move 100% of my production of cutting edge whatever chips to your fabs in South Korea, and you're going to start air freighting them the other way around the world?
You're right that it would have significant impacts on large trillion-dollar companies like Apple. And what you would probably see very quickly is China cut off its supply chains to large American companies like Apple. It would probably attempt its domestic companies like Huawei and Xiaomi to fill the void in global demand for cell phones with its domestic companies to try to use that window to gain market share and basically try to decimate American companies. And so it's
economic warfare as well.
Economic warfare. During World War II, there was this concept called total warfare, which is war on all fronts, financial, military, and so forth. It would very much be that way in a war with China, except the aperture of war would be so vast just because our technology today is just so expansive and reaches into so many parts of our lives.
So just to step back from that brink for a moment, I mean, that's an outcome that sounds so catastrophic that I think the sort of logical fatalist in any of us is like, what do we all need to be doing to prepare?
Well, it's especially cataclysmic if you're a hardware company that relies on supply chains in China, or if you're a fund that has billions of dollars in investments tied up in illiquid assets in China. It's really not that cataclysmic if you have already started reshoring operations, whether it's in Vietnam or in India.
But to be clear, it's a really big world out there, but the rest of the world doesn't have the supply chains, the materials, the expertise, all of that institutional knowledge that China now in some ways has sole possession of.
Well, it didn't 20 years ago. So it wasn't always this way. I mean, the iMac was made in Elk Grove, California up until the early 2000s. So, you know, when we think about, oh, gee, it would be so impossible to make these phones elsewhere, it really wasn't that long ago that the map looked very, very different.
That was Jacob Hellberg, a member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, speaking with the WSJ's tech columnist, Christopher Mims. And that's it for Tech News Briefing. Today's show was produced by Julie Chang with supervising producer Melanie Roy. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
From NPR Technology at 4:08 a.m. today.
Have you ever thought about how we got into this situation where most of us are typing, tapping, or scrolling on screens much of the day? Well, NPR's special series Body Electric is investigating our relationship between our technology and our bodies. And its host, Manoush Zomorodi of the TED Radio Hour, is here. So last week, you asked folks to sign up to be part of a study that you're doing with Columbia University Medical Center. Give us an update on the project that you're doing with listeners.
Okay, so we are partnering with researchers at Columbia who have found that the minimum amount of movement we need to offset the harms of our sedentary, screen-filled lives is strolling for 5 minutes every half hour. But, you know, it's one thing to make this finding in the lab. Can we actually do this in the real world? So we're doing a crowdsourced study, and tens of thousands of people have signed up to give it a try. This week, they'll be collecting baseline data. Next week, they will try adding these movement snacks to their day.
So now another part of the series is looking at how our bodies are adapting to all our tech use and how we got to this point where nearly 85% of our jobs are sedentary and people spend the majority of their time when they're not sleeping looking at a screen.
Yeah. So in our first 2 episodes, we investigated how economies have shaped the human body over the ages. And I talked to Vibar Cregan-Reid. He's a professor of environmental humanities at the University of Kent in the UK. And he says that human characteristics have changed because of what we do all day.
The density of the upper arm bone in female hunter-gatherers was greater than Olympic rowers.
So, if I time travel from back then, I would definitely beat you at arm wrestling.
Sorry to break it to you, but beating me in anything is not a high bar of achievement. It really is.
Okay, I could beat anyone then at arm wrestling. So anatomically, modern humans have been around for about 300,000 years. But hey, it really wasn't until about 5,000 years ago that the chair was invented.
And the reason that people didn't have them is they had no use of them. You know, if you're working on the land, you haven't really got much time to be sitting around.
So it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that most workers could sit. And then in the 1930s, white-collar work starts. And that is when we get humans sitting for a living. Later, then into the 1970s and 80s, that's when the computer comes into the office and then into our homes. And that's when we start contorting our bodies to suit this new tool. And I spoke to Lane Nooney, a computer and video game historian at New York University.
I think a lot of us don't realize how much pain we live in because of our interactions with computing. So there's the extended sitting. There's the use of the keyboard, which causes all sorts of strain in the wrists, the hands, the fingers, the elbows. There's the posture of sitting, which has the back, the shoulders, the neck. And then you're also maintaining a very specific head posture by looking at the screen.
All right, so all that sounds really familiar. What's your tip this week about trying to feel better?
Yeah, so as you go about the next week, just kind of notice how long you sit between breaks. 1 hour, 3 hours, until your left leg falls asleep. What are your habits? And then next week, we'll talk about how to get movement into your day.
That's Manoush Zomorodi, host of NPR's TED Radio Hour and a special series, Body Electric. Catch new episodes every Tuesday in the TED Radio Hour podcast feed or at npr.org/bodyelectric. Manoush, thank you very much.
Thank you, A.
That's all for now.